Nagy tisztelettel és szeretettel köszöntjük a KETEG nevében vendégeinket és hallgatóinkat, akik valós időben online követik jelen beszélgetésünket. A technika ördöge miatt hiába készültünk tolmácsolásra, sajnos sokadik próbálkozásra se sikerült a mai nap beindítani és megfelelően beállítani a fordítást, ezért előre is elnézést kérünk. A beszélgetés bevezető része magyarul történik, a kerekasztal beszélgetés angolul, tolmácsolás nélkül. Későbbiekben viszont ezek az anyagok fordítással, alámondással, angol-magyar szöveggel is elérhetők lesznek az interneten. Elsőként szeretném felkérni Baris Laura nővért, a KETEG alapítóját, és a KETEG képzés szakfelelősét, hogy mutassa be a hallgatóság számára a KETEG képzést és a KETEG közösséget.
Szeretettel üdvözlök mindenkit, nagyon készültünk erre a konferenciára, és ezzel kapcsolatosan arra, hogy a KETEG-et megismertessük minél szélesebb körben. Először is azokat üdvözölném, akik most először csatlakoztak hozzánk, és kíváncsiak a KETEG-re. Utána azokat üdvözölném sok szeretettel, akik már régebbi ismerőseink, és most ők kíváncsiak a konferenciára, hogy mit is hozunk a tarsolyunkban most legújabban. Aztán üdvözlöm volt hallgatóinkat, az alumni hallgatókat, akik közül biztos, hogy többen is itt vannak közöttünk, és szeretettel üdvözlöm munkatársainkat is, akik lehetővé tették a konferencia létrejöttét, mind tartalmában, mind technikailag, de legforróbban talán előadóinkat üdvözölném, akiket majd részletesen bemutat Dabóci Kálmán. Róluk csak annyit szeretnék mondani, hogy régi barátai a KETEG-nek, régi segítői, támogatói. Helen Alford például, amikor megalakult a KETEG 2010-ben, nagyon sokat segített, és az Angelikumnak a tantárgyi menüje adta az alapot a KETEG tantárgyainak a kitalálásához. Stefano Zamányi is régi barátunk, bármikor, amikor hívom, akkor jön és előadást tart, órákat tart, tehát ő már egy régi ismerősünk, de Róna Péterről is ezt mondhatnám, akivel legutóbb Oxfordban jártunk egy konferencián, ez is egy online konferencia volt. Dióhéjban a KETEG-ről annyit szeretnék elmondani, hogy ez a keresztény társadalmi elvek a gazdaságban szó mozaiknak a rövidítése, amit úgy szoktunk apostrofálni, hogy ez egy alternatív gazdasági képzés az egyház társadalmi tanításának az alapján, amely tágabb értelemben visszanyúlik egészen Arisztotelészig, a középkorban Aquinói Szent Tamásig, vagy pedig emblematikus korszak a Európa olasz részén, itáliai részén a 15-18. században a civil gazdaság, aminek Antonio Genovesi volt a képviselője, egy katolikus pap, aki közgazdász volt, és a Nápolyi Egyetem tanszékvezető tanára. Ő tulajdonképpen Adam Smith párjának lehet mondani a déli régióban, és Stefano Zamányi nagyon sokat ír a civil gazdaságról, és lehet olvasni könyveket erről a korszakról és erről a tudósról. A KETEG-en bemutatott gazdasági és emberképi szemléletmód alternatívát nyújt a haszonelvűségen alapuló főáramú közgazdaságtanhoz képest, bár a gazdasági paletta rendkívül széles és színes manapság, inkább ezért azt mondanám, hogy a KETEG kovászként megtermékenyíti a tésztát, vagyis a gazdasági életet, a fenntarthatóság és az emberközpontúság céljaira fókuszálva. Mind a gyakorlatban vannak gazdasági hálózatok, mozgalmak, amelyek ezt a szellemet közvetítik, és az egyik volt hallgatónk kikutatta, hogy kb. 46 vagy 50 olyan szervezet, egyetemi központ, egyetem van, amelyik az egyház társadalmi tanítása alapú közgazdaságtant hirdeti. Tehát széles merítésünk van külföldről is. Ezt a fajta gondolatvilágot tükrözi a KETEG-nek a tantárgyi kínálata, amit 3 tantárblogba osztottunk be. Van egy teológia-filozófiai tantárblog, itt antropológiai kérdésekkel, tehát az emberrel foglalkozó kérdésekkel foglalkoznak a tantárgyak, hiszen ugye az a mi meglátásunk, hogy az ember nem eszköze, hanem alanya, alapja és célja a gazdasági életnek, így az embert nagyon részletesen szeretnénk megismerni. Aztán van egy társadalomtudományi blokk ilyen tárgyakkal, mint jog, politológia, szociológia, stb. Ezek látókörbővítésű szolgálnak, és a legnagyobb blokk a gazdasági blokk, ahol olyan közgazdász professzorok híres neves, mint a Csat Magdolna is fog oktatni nálunk. Ezek a professzorok az emberközpontúság szellemében oktatják a gazdasági szaktárgyakat. Az új kurzus szeptembertől indul, a Szapiencia Szerzetes és Hittudományi Főiskola ad otthont neki, ugye, mint mondtam, itt indult az egész képzés 2010-ből, és most szeptember 10-éig lehet jelentkezni erre a képzésre, ami nem más, mint egy posztgraduális, 4 szemeszteres esti levelező képzés, egy diploma szükséges a bejelentkezéshez. A Corvinuson is van KETEG képzés, itt emberközpontú gazdaság a neve a tantárgyaknak, egy szemeszteres választható tárgyak képében folyik a képzés. És végül megemlíteném a jelen konferenciákat nagyon röviden, amelyet a Covid járvány jelenségei ihlettek egészen szorosan. Az online oktatás, az otthoni tanulás, a home office-nak a jelensége és a modern technika lehetőségei, valamint megihlette a témát a KETEG hallgatóknak a kérdőíves véleménynyilvánítása, ahol ők azt írták, hogy a KETEG-ben az első értékek közé tartozik a közösség. Szakértőink és az önök aktív részvétele alapján úgy érzem, hogy izgalmas diskurzust várhatunk, ezt vetítjük elő, és akkor átadom a szót Dabóci Kálmánnak, hogy folytassa le ezt a izgalmasnak ígérkező konferenciát. Köszönöm szépen!
Köszönjük szépen a rövid ismertetést. A KETEG-et Laura nő segített elhelyezni a hazai és nemzetközi térképen. Én a 72 tanítvány mozgalomról mondanék csak egyetlen egy mondatot, mint a program együttműködő partnere, akinek az ajánlásával, támogatásával jelen meg ez a konferencia. Nagy megtiszteltetés nekünk, hogy a KETEG közösség bizalmat szavazott nekünk. Ennek azért volt némi alapja, valljuk be, mert jó magam is évtizedek óta ennek a közösségnek a tagja vagyok, és az egész előzményében is személyesen is sok éve együttműködünk, de a személyes kapcsolaton túl azért már egy intézményi kapcsolat is kialakult, jó látni, hogy van mire építeni. A 72 tanítvány mozgalom egy katolikus szakmai közösségek, műhelyek, platformok hálózata, a Nemzetközi Akció Katolikának is a része. De a konferenciánk, a fő fókuszpont a mai nap, azon belül is a digitális kommunikáció és a személyes kapcsolatnak a viszonya erre a kérdéskörre épül föl, és ahogy Laura nővér is mondta, 1,5 éve az élet minden területét érintő egészségügyi világjárvány közvetlen hatása alatt élünk, dolgozunk. Ennek hatására egy világméretű kísérleti laborrá változott a bolygónk, és különösen a kommunikáció és a kapcsolattartás területén. És rendkívüli időket élünk, rendkívüli eszközök és rendkívüli alkalmazkodó képességekre van szükségünk. Ez a konferencia se olyan, mint bármelyik korábban. Ez a konferencia 2 részből áll. Az egyik az előadókkal, illetve a kerekasztal beszélgetés résztvevőivel már korábban egy körülbelül fél órás beszélgetés, interjú került felvételre, amelyet a közösségi média csatornáinkon keresztül meg is osztottunk. Reméljük, minél többen megnézték ezt a mai konferencia előtt, de ha nem, akkor utána bizonyosan meg fogják nézni. Nem ugyanazokat fogjuk elmondani, megismételni, de azért nagyon sok kérdés vissza fog köszönni azokból a gondolatokból. A második része pedig egy kerekasztal beszélgetés, amelynek most is a részei vagyunk. Körülbelül 1 órás beszélgetés után pedig a hallgatóság számára is kinyitjuk a kérdezés lehetőségét, és buzdítanék is mindenkit, hogy a megosztott csatornáinkon, akár a KETEG, akár a 72 tanítvány mozgalom Facebook oldalán írják meg az üzenetüket, írják meg a kérdéseiket, amelyeket szeretnénk föltenni a panelbeszélgetés résztvevőinek, akiket ezúton szeretnék bemutatni. Első körben köszöntöm nagy tisztelettel Helen Alford domonkos nővért, aki a római Szent Tamás Egyetem rektor helyettese, főszakmai területei a menedzsment, az emberközpontú technológia és a CSR. Következőként köszöntöm Stefano Zamani professzor urat, a Bologna Egyetem kiváló közgazdász professzorát, aki a jól léti társadalom és a civil gazdaság nemzetközi szakértője. Velünk van szintén domonkos háttérrel Alejandro Rosweit atya, a Római Szent Tamás Egyetem társadalomtudományi karának dékánja. Az ő fő kutatási területe a hit és a kultúra, a tömegtájékoztatás, a filmtudományok és az egyház társadalmi tanítása. Udvariasságból magyar szereplőket hagytuk, vagy magyar származású szereplőket hagytuk így erre a körnek a végére, de ez nem jelent semmiféle rangsort, hisz ha végignézzük a névsort, mindenki doktori címmel, legmagasabb nemzetközileg is elismert tudományos fokozattal rendelkezik, úgyhogy itt nagyon komoly nemzetközileg elismert szakembereket sikerült a mai délutánra összehozni. Köszöntöm tisztelettel Róna Péter, jogász, közgazdász, korábbi bankigazgató, nagyvállalati felsővezetőt, aki jelenleg is oktató a Domonkos Rend által fenntartott Oxfordi Blackfriars Egyetemen. És régi ismerősként, barátként köszöntöm Héj Tibort, aki társadalmi vállalkozó, tanácsadó, a Proactive Management Consulting Kft. Ügyvezető tulajdonosa. Kedves vendégeink, kedves hallgatóság, innentől kezdve viszont átváltunk angol nyelvre, így a közvetítés angolul lesz követhető most így élőben, és ahogy mondtuk, később magyar fordításként is elérhető lesz. So now we switch to English, and I intentionally start with an emotional, or one might say, populist question. How many times have you experienced this week to be fed up with digital communication? Zoom meetings, overflowing emails, lack of hugs, lack of personal presence. The audience can share or can vote on the Facebooks, just sending their answers. So very shortly, how about you? What is your result, Sister Helen?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I express my gratitude to Sister Laura for this opportunity. Let me answer, starting from this consideration. One of the major confusion of thought typical of the digital revolution is the one that tries to make us believe that connection and relations are the same things. That is a major mistake, because connection refers also to animals and things, but relations, it's a property of human beings only. And so what is the point? That is true that the new technologies have increased enormously connection. As people say, we are all day long connected, but that does not mean that we are in interpersonal relations. And that is a major danger. In fact, the production and fruition of relational goods in our societies, in particular in the Western type society, is decreasing year after year. And that explains phenomena such as the decrement of the happiness index and the decrement of many other indicators referring to the quality of life. The quantity of life increases, but the quality of life. Why? Because human beings need relational goods. For our, let's say, well-being, we need not only private goods and public goods, but we also need relational goods. And the fact is that the digital revolution today is creating this type of scarcity, the scarcity of relational goods. We can observe that in particular among the young people. The young people are always connected, but they feel always very lonely, and loneliness is a major determinant of unhappiness or of sadness, etc. The other aspect connected to the question has to do with a new phenomenon. There is now a near consensus that the current public sphere does not serve us well. In other words, there is an interesting commentary in the New York Times, published in the year 2019, by Albert Newitz. The title is "Social Media is Broken." And the journalist writes, social media has poisoned the way we communicate with each other and undermined the democratic process. Many of us just want to get away from it. But we can't imagine a world without it, unquote. So this is a real problem. The first aspect is what I said, relationality as a major cause of unhappiness. This second aspect refers to the democratic process. It is a fact that today the democratic principle is in real danger, unless we misunderstand the notion of democracy, which is, by the way, a very old notion going back to Aristotle more than 2,400 years ago. So that is why it is important to start a sort of public debate on these issues, because we, in my opinion, we cannot continue along the path that we have been following so far. Some people say, oh, but the social media, the new technology increase efficiency. It's not true. It's only people who never studied properly economics can say these things, because efficiency has another meaning. Probably the people confuse efficiency with productivity, and that again constitutes a major drawback in our public debate. Since I've been told to stay within 3 minutes, I had better stopping here.
Thank you, Merre. Professor Samani has just jumped in the middle of the jungle, and I just wanted to ask a very short question at the beginning, that how many times do you feel fed up with digital communication? So all the other participants have enough time to think about and just give a number. How about you, Helen, Sister Helen?
Myself, you mean?
No. I answered this question now to Sister Helen.
I can't give you a time, because I think it's because mostly I'm in digital communication with people I know. So I don't see the big distinction. And I think this is an interesting question. How do we use this technology with relation to other relations that we have?
And how about you, Father Alejandro?
At least for me, it's been an increase, I would say, especially with regards to the students and with meetings here at the university. So because now everything is online, where usually was more on one-on-one personal relationship. So definitely our time on social media and internet, it has increased for me. And I do feel the impact. So.
Thank you. And Professor Roland?
I think I've not experienced the sensation of being fed up with this form of communication. It seems to me that what it does, it has created a new type of communication, which I would describe as impersonal personal communication. So there is a personal communication between the participants on the screen, but it has an impersonal character. Even in cases where we are talking to people or conversing with people who we know. So I think it's, I agree with Professor Zamani in many respects, with the slight caveat that rather than causing something to be missed that hitherto we have had, the Zoom, the internet permits a new form of communication, the parameters and dynamics of which are very much in an earlier stage of development. And it's very hard to say anything about it, except to say that certainly the emotional depth that direct personal contact affords is indeed missing, and that is a loss.
Thank you very much. And Tibor, we are working in a very tough business environment where everybody is very busy and rushy. How did you feel yourself in an everyday digital communication?
If you have asked me 3 months ago, I would have said every day I'm fed up with being jumping from one meeting to the other over the internet. But by now, since meetings are open and the world has changed, I am in a balanced, I can continue with a balanced life as I did before the COVID period, which means, of course, I have Zoom meetings like this one, which enables for all of us to meet although otherwise it would have been very difficult. And I also have personal meetings. So I think by now, at least here in Hungary, it's again a much easier period coming, and has started recently with all these vaccines.
It's good to see, and I think it's the right time to organize this conference, because 2 months ago or 3 months ago, as Tibor mentioned, maybe the mood should have been something slightly different. So we now try to zoom out in the timeline, and we try to focus in the last 1.5 years, which we can call the pandemic period. And what is the best experience, the most memorable experience for you in digital communication? Because I want to focus also on the bright side of digital communication, not only blame the whole technology. So let's start with good experience. Helen?
Okay, well, I can give one good experience. I found that when I was teaching my classes, students who would never ask questions when they were in class would ask questions. And I think they didn't feel threatened, but in front of all these other students, they were just talking to their professor, and they just started talking. So there was a sense in which I could have more contact with some students who were too scared, usually, to talk in front of all the others. So that was a good experience for me.
How about you, Professor Zamani? What is your best experience in digital communication in the last 1.5 years?
Well, you see, last year and the present academic year, all at least in the University of Bologna, where I do teach, all the classes were done remotely by using digital technique. Now, what I have discovered is the following: if the purpose of a teaching, of an education, of an institution like a university or even schools, is that of instructing, it is obvious that the new digital techniques are helpful and from a certain point of view also more productive. But if the purpose is also education, which is completely different from instruction, it is obvious that the utilization of the new digital devices is very detrimental. Very detrimental. The point is that I asked my students, I taught 3 different courses, so 3 different classes, and all of them, I was surprised, apart very few, underlined this aspect. They said, it is true that we learned what you were teaching. You have given us the various slides, etc. But what we lacked is the interpersonal relation. And that is, it is true. In other words, depends what we want. If we keep on separating instruction from education, and we decide that the school institution, in general terms, is not supposed to educate, then we can go ahead with this technique. But that is a major decision, which is a moral decision. It's not a technical decision. So we had better deciding whether or not we want an institution, which we call school or university, to limit itself only to instruction. Of course, there are pros and cons in both sides, but my opinion is that we do not serve the purpose of truth if we do not face this dilemma. Well, when last October 15, Pope Francis, as you know, the Global Pact on Education, in that document, he stressed exactly this point. Actually, he was addressing himself, as Sister Helen knows very well, in particular to the Catholic universities, when he rebuked them, saying, you have forgotten your first mission, which is that to educate, which does not mean that you should not instruct at the highest level. But if you forget your first mission, you miss the point. So this is an open question, and I have reason to believe that in the near future, major public debates will be started.
Thank you very much. And what about you, Alejandro? What would you recall from your memories about this best experience?
My best experience, I would say, was 2 months ago, and it was a conference organized by the British and the Australian embassies to the Holy See. And the topic was the question of the peoples in the Pacific Islands, which really I had no much knowledge except for Hawaii. It belongs to the States. But I think, kind of addressing also what Professor Samaniu was saying, I mean, for me, that conference was really education, instruction, formation, and a field trip altogether. And the reason was because thanks to Zoom, we were able to have experts from Australia, from England, talking about kind of the global impact that the economies, the coronavirus, the pandemics has on the Pacific Islands. But the special experience was that they actually had iPhones on the different islands where they were interviewing families that were directly being affected by climate change, that were directly being affected by the pandemic. And so no scholar could really tell the story that these people that were there experiencing the effects of what we're talking about in this conference, there was no other experience like that. It was almost like when in high school you went on a field trip and visited the museum or visited the local community that you were studying. So I think one of the real strengths of social communication is that actually can put you in the lives of other peoples and people who are actually experiencing that which you're investigating. So for me, this conference was incredible because we not only had the experts from a worldwide perspective, but we also had the perspective of the common person that we usually don't get to hear. And so that was the best experience I've had this year.
Thank you very much. Professor Rono, what is your story?
Well, I organized a symposium not very long ago in which Sister Laura participated from Oxford, that had the participation of people in the United Kingdom, in various European countries, United States, Australia, and South America. And it worked in the sense that everyone was able to communicate their point of view in a organized and rather disciplined way. So I do think that this form of communication is efficient in the sense that it is very good at transmitting information, points of view, etc., without much emotional content or resonance. In terms of teaching, unfortunately, it was not made for me. I teach in small groups. They're sort of like tutorials or very small groups of people that rely very heavily on interpersonal relationships. And I teach in a way where I try to understand what the student is thinking, where the student is missing something. So I pay very close attention to the student in that sense. And I'm afraid that I am unable to do that through this medium. It just doesn't really work for me. So I'm not a very good teacher on the internet, but I am a reasonably good conference participant. There's different things. I do not get the emotional satisfaction, the joy of teaching through the internet, and the conference is a different kind of emotional world.
And how about you, Tibor?
Maybe it's a surprise for some of you, but this past 1 year pandemic period opened new worlds for me, because compared to the previous period, it was much easier and much more cost-effective to join conferences. So every month I joined at least 1, 2, sometimes 3 conferences without any travel costs, without any problems with how to stay, what to do meanwhile, and so on. And by the way, during that period, very often it was free or at a very low cost, the participation fee. So I really enjoyed to learn a lot. Since as a strategic investor, I have clients in different industries where I'm not familiar with the details, but through these conferences I could develop myself. And I think that's a very good opportunity for everybody who would like to and who is interested to do so, because even the networking part, recently, just a week ago, I got a questionnaire, and it also asked about the efficacy of conferences, and among the questions there was about networking. Even the networking for me was much better, because usually in such conferences, those who know each other anyway, they come together in the spare part or in the afternoon or at parties, and I feel a little bit abandoned. But this time it was well organized. You could previously search and click for the right persons you would like to get in contact with, and the system arranged meetings. So being in Hungary was not a problem for a conference in India, for example, and otherwise I couldn't have taken part in it. And I think it's for both parts, because I joined conferences which I otherwise wouldn't have. So they had a broader audience, and it was an enrichment for me as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. It was really a very rich snapshot about the experiences. And I think we can agree that since we are human, we have limitations, even in the field of communication. But according to your faith, there is someone who is perfect, even in communication. And guess who? Of course, the answer is God. And the discussion, or as we call it, the prayer with God, is a personal or a digital communication, because we can't see God in himself, or maybe very rarely, or just someone. Or sometimes we can't hear it, not well enough, like here in Zoom. So is it personal or digital communication when we are praying? Just a very short yes or no, and a one-sentence explanation. We start with Sister Helen again.
Well, I think it's personal, but it's personal in the sense of a spiritual being. We're connecting with God through our reason and through our spiritual reality. And so, yes, it's personal, our connection with God.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What do you think, Professor Zamani?
Well, it seems to me that it would be important to distinguish the notion of information from communication, because they are completely different. Communication has the same root as common. In other words, to communicate, you have to put something in common between you and me, or me and others, etc. That is not requested in an information structure. In other words, it is true that the new technology increased enormously the information, but that is not the same thing as communication, because we know what are the elements of the so-called common action, and it is obvious that unless we have something in common, the so-called tacit knowledge will never be extracted from our interpersonal relations. There is a famous book by Michael Polanyi. Polanyi, I'm sure that you know, he comes from your country. He is the brother of the more perhaps well-known Karl Polanyi. But it seems to me that Michael Polanyi, it's from a certain point of view, is deeper than his brother. He published, as you know, in 1966, if I'm correct, by the University of Chicago Press, the book called The Tacit Dimension. Now, this book, which in my opinion is one of the most important books ever written, was put on a side. Do you know why? Because Polanyi, at a certain point, while he was in England for a certain period, he decided to become Catholic. He converted to Catholicism. And then he was immediately discriminated, because it was not conceivable that, because the family was a Jew family, but then he was not practicing any religion. He was, so to speak, atheist in a generic sense. And then he converted himself. And since then, he was discriminated. So this book, in fact, is very, very seldom quoted. And in my opinion, it's a fundamental, because he talks about the so-called tacit knowledge. In other words, it's that knowledge which lies inside each one of us, but cannot be brought outside unless there is an interpersonal relation. And in other words, you cannot extract the test knowledge from people through digital information. It is impossible. Whatever one can be. You can transmit information, that is true. You can transmit what is called codified knowledge, but not a tacit knowledge. So it's a matter of distinguishing, which does not mean that one thing is bad, the other good, but not, in my opinion, we should avoid it to make conflation, making confusion of concepts. Because nowadays, of course, we need a more codified knowledge, but we also need more tacit knowledge. And unless you have such an interpersonal relations, that remains that way. Well, there are full of examples. For instance, a school teacher. A school teacher interrogates a pupil. Suppose that pupil is shy by nature, is not outspoken. That he, while answering the question of the school teacher, he or she will not cut a good figure. And sometimes the school teacher says, oh, you are lazy, you did not study, which is not true. It's simply because the school teacher was unable to entertain a personal relation. And when that is done, that same pupil exhibits his or her full knowledge. Then many are the examples of this type, in particular in the working place. So that is why it seems to me that it's proper in this time, while appreciating by all means the new technology, etc., but complement these major results and achievements with the other dimension.
Thank you very much. And we turn to the original question whether when we are talking with God without seeing and hearing him sometimes, Father Alejandro, do you think it's personal? And when we talk with the same way with another guy, then it's unhuman? How is it so?
I mean, I would say that it's both. I would say it's personal and it's virtual in the sense that it is personal, as Sister Helen said. So ultimately, our communion with God is a personal experience that we gain through prayer, through reading of the scriptures, etc. But it's also mediated because, especially in our church, which is a sacramental church, so grace is mediated through the sacraments. The word, the relationship with God is mediated through water, through bread, through wine, through all the elements that we use in our sacraments. So it is both. So in one sense, it's virtual in the sense that it's not a direct one through when it's mediated, especially through sacrament. But at the same time, they can be channels to have a personal experience of God through those sacraments, through that mediation, through those elements that we're using in the liturgy, through music, through hearing of the word, through celebration, basically. God's presence is mediated to us. And at the same time, our own presence is mediated to the others, as well as being personal at the same time.
Professor Runa, do you agree that the transcendent communication can be classified somehow into these categories like personal or digital communication, or it's an absolutely different dimension?
I think it's more complex than that. I don't think those two categories exhaust all that there is. And I am very grateful to Professor Zavagni for having made mention of Michael Polanyi, who expressed his thesis with great elegance in a simple sentence, which is worth quoting: "We know more than we can say."
Yes.
And it is that portion of what we know that we cannot say, which I think is the hard core of a genuine prayer. One can recite a prayer when one can pray. Those are two different things.
Yeah.
And some parts of the Catholic Church, like formalism, like punctual attendance of Mass, like careful and thorough observance of ritual. But I think that the heart and soul of the faith is not really there. It's that part. And I think this is what made Polanyi, who I studied fairly carefully, a Catholic, the realization that there is a part of us that we cannot say, and that we can only really reveal only to God in ultimately. So that's my take on the subject. As I say, I don't think that one can break it down into these two categories that you mentioned. It's more complicated and deeper in some ways.
Well, interesting approaches. Tibor, what do you say to this question?
In the last round, I mentioned that I joined a lot of conferences, and they were digital ones. I joined them to get information, knowledge, background, system, approach, and so on. I was, frankly speaking, not interested in the person who delivered the message, but in the topic, maybe the company name for future purposes. In case with God, my relationship is completely different. God doesn't need information from me. God doesn't even need anything from me, but the purpose of the prayer is that I can share my life. And as we heard with the quotes from Polanyi, I try to share myself, not information, not data. God has access to the big data, which is about me. And he's not, his intention is to become a partner, a personal relationship, and for that way, prayer and all the rest of this kind of actions aim to be in communion and to give myself, and not just information and not just data. And that's why I think it's personal.
Well, then we have to dig deeper and try to find somehow that what makes communication personal or human. Sister Helen, what exactly? The visual reality, the voice that we can hear each other, the nonverbal elements, or maybe that the personal presence, or even deeper or focused attention to the person who is speaking. What makes our communication personal or human?
Well, I think it's another really deep question, and probably everybody will answer it in a slightly different way, and we'll get a very complete answer across all of our speakers today. I think if we're talking about communication, we're talking about something that's shared. So I think the crucial thing to me is that it's something to someone in particular. It's someone with whom I'm trying to share something. And we can do that through writing a letter or through a phone call. You know, long before we had any digital communications, we did also use other means which were not putting us face to face. However, if we are face to face, we know, and much modern research shows us now, that the type of communication we can have is far richer and far deeper, and we need it a lot more. And of course, if you're talking about little children, they need this, especially touch and things like this, in order to learn and to grow and to be healthy. And you know, and we still need this when we are adults, even though we don't need it so in such an existential way as a child does. So I think it's what I think makes it personal is that I'm relating to someone as a person. It's more about who I'm talking to than it is about me, even though it's me who's making the communication. So when someone says personal communication to me, I'm thinking about it's this two-way thing, this building this relationship, this kind of shared good between us, which is the communication that we have.
Well, thank you very much. And Professor Zamani, do you think that digital communication and the new technologies, communication technologies are really designed and valid for real communication, or are they just suitable for exchange of information?
Oh, certainly, exchange of information is perfectly okay. It's so much very important. What I wanted to stress before is a real and a proper communication presupposes that the people involved, as Sister Helen correctly said a minute ago, they must share something. And in particular, they must share the purpose for which they communicate. In other words, if I ask you what time the last train to Rome last, that is an information. But I do not need to involve you in my decision to take that train or not. But in the proper communication, everybody, every participant must share the same, let's say, purpose, namely achieving the truth. I know that today speaking about truth, it's unpopular, but I have reasons to believe, just because we live in a post-truth society, but it will not last because people are getting fed up. Because the very moment we lose the notion of truth, what's the purpose of living? What's the purpose of trying to make efforts of one type or the other? So through communication, we try, which does not necessarily mean that we achieve it, but we want to communicate in order to grasp or to arrive at truth. Truth, which has to be qualified according to the area, could be the truth in a scientific endeavor, could be the truth on many philosophical grounds, never mind. But two people really communicate when both of them are really and honestly interested to achieve the truth, even though each one of them pursues a different approach or a different road. That is what is important, is the final end of the process itself. And again, communication is a word which should be distinguished from another word, which is cooperation. So we have three levels: information, communication, and cooperation. Because cooperation adds to communication the not only putting together, joining or sharing the ultimate purpose, but also putting together certain means, certain, in other words, ways to achieve the target. And that is why cooperation is a critical word, which nowadays, in particular in the economic area, is knowing a new, so to speak, renaissance. Because people are understanding that without cooperation, competition will transform the market into a jungle. A market cannot continue to produce the good benefits without cooperation, trying to counterbalance, or not to counterbalance, but to keep in balance the competitive. Competition is important, but if competition is not, as I said, balanced with cooperation, the market tends to destroy itself. So that is why it is important, in my opinion, to distinguish the three levels. All of them have their major, as Peter said before, the problem arises when we confuse them without understanding the pros and cons of each one of the three notions I was talking about a minute ago. Thank you. Now I have to beg your pardon to all our friends, my friend Helen, Peter, and Tibor, and Alejandro, because you see, I have to connect myself in another business, because Helen, she knows what happens in Italy, in particular in a city which is called Rome, or a sub-city which is called the Vatican. That is why Helen does not want to go to the Vatican, and she's very wise, because at 6 I have another Zoom meeting for the usual chaotic problems emerging in that area. So I apologize, but I have to leave you now in order, because at 6, which means in a few minutes, I have to connect myself to that. So many thanks for this invitation, and KETEG, you should continue, because you are really a point of reference by now in your country and also elsewhere. Thank you very much for your effort. I never met Alejandro. I understand that Alejandro comes from a Latin American or not, but I hope
Mexico, from Mexico. Where? Mexico.
From Mexico. Tú hablas español entonces.
Sí, también.
I hope to see you in Rome, in the important university which is called Angelico, because next time Helen will become director that will be the first woman to become rector of Angela. Do you agree or not? Do you agree or not? You have to agree, because we want Helen to become rector. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Very much, Professor Zamani.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dabowski. Thank you.
All the best.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, Peter.
Ciao.
Well, it's really a pity that so many programs and opportunities are here to discuss, and Professor Zamani timetable not made possible to stay with us till the end of the program. But we go further, and I would like to address the next question to Father Alejandro, because a snapshot from your interview we just broadcasted this week on Facebook, the picture was something like that: kids in Rome, in Italy, protesting for going back to school. And do we humans really need to communicate to each other personally, especially the children? Helen Orford already touched these topics, but when yes, then where does this inner need come from?
I mean, as has been said through this whole conference, it's the question of the personal encounter, the body language. I mean, as Professor Zamani was talking about the different levels of information, communication, etc. I mean, even there, even in information, which would be the most basic level, as Zamani said, body language communicates a lot. And we are missing that through virtual communication. It's already difficult, even person to person, when we're dealing with different cultures, to understand what different cultural symbols and gestures mean when we're communicating. It's even more difficult online, because even people of the same culture we are not looking at the whole body. We're not seeing all the gestures, all the messages basically that we communicate also with our bodies. And so I think that's what's missing. And I mean, as a professor, as I was saying originally, when I teach online, it's like teaching to a wall. Even though I'm seeing all the students in the different screens, etc., but it's teaching to a wall. There's some element of the body language, of the body presence that is missing. Even if I say, did you understand what I said? Is this clear? By looking at their faces, there's kind of this blank look, because they're so used to watching television and so on, where there's no real emotional interaction. So also in the classroom, that's how they're communicating. And I think especially little children feel that the strongest, that there's that personal communication happening between the teacher and the students. And especially little kids are more used to this kind of interaction and touching and so on. That is definitely missing. So to the point that children are asking to come back to school, which was unheard of a couple of years ago. So even our students here at the university level, they're asking to come back. So for next year, we're starting hopefully everything back in the classroom, because we do need it, especially when we're dealing with different cultures. Because here at the Angelicum, especially, we have students from Africa, from Europe, from the Americas, etc. And it's already difficult to communicate. We were speaking about this in the meeting yesterday, that our students have to take, for example, English and Italian. And their level of advancement in the language has been minimal this year, because all the classes have been online. So even for them to learn a language, it's much easier to learn it in person, where they see the gestures, they see the one-on-one communication, than online. Online, it simply didn't work. So we noticed was that they went from 1.3 to 1.4 in their knowledge of the language. So I think everybody's perceiving this, especially with regards to education and communication across cultures and different languages.
Thank you very much. And Professor Rona, also when I watched your interview, I noticed that, as you call it, as a paradox, that on one hand we face with exponentially growing opportunities or possibilities and platforms to communicate, and on the other hand, there have never been so many lonely people, even among those who are communicating all the day. Why is it so, and where do we lose each other in that rigid technological environment?
Well, if you will forgive me, I'll try to answer this question through a personal experience.
You're welcome.
My great uncle was a village priest in Hungary, in a very small village of 520 souls. And as a small boy, I spent my summers with him. And as I grew up, I reflected a lot on those summer experiences that I had with him. He was an absolutely remarkable human being who went from house to house, from family to family, and had this very short, brief, very restrained way of talking to them. And as I got older, I thought when I was 7, 8, 10, 12, I thought he was a magician, because the effect that he had on the lives of these people was really remarkable, that he could have this. And as I got older and thought about it, and I also talked to him about it, what was happening was that he found his way to sharing the truth with the person he was speaking with. Not necessarily through language, not even body language, but it was really a spiritual reach to get to a truth about the life of that other person, that person understood, and being really rather uneducated and ignorant and all of that and inarticulate, was quite unable to express it. And here comes this priest who gets it, who understands why I am an alcoholic and I beat my wife and I hate myself for it. And he understands it, he gets it. And I saw him, it brings tears to my eyes even now. I saw him get these people, a number of these people, out of these horrible, horrible life structures that circumstances or whatever, inflicted on them, because he was able to get to a truth without any extensive language, without recourse to a great deal of language. It was a spiritual gesture, the spiritual reach that enabled him to do that. Now, and I truly believe in that. And I might add to that is that my enormous admiration and devotion to Pope Francis comes from the fact that he somehow reminds me of my great uncle in his ability to understand the suffering of people. And that is not something that is really easily achieved through electronic communication. I think that is a very at least I think maybe humanity will evolve to a point where it can also be reached through the screen. But right now, I think that is very much a part of our humanity as we understand it, when it works. And when it works, it has enormous power. It has transformational power. It's what great marriages are about, having common truths. It's what great friendships are about, and in a way, it is for me personally. I don't want to carry on about my personal things, but it is really my personal basis for my faith. This element.
Mm-hmm. Well, in contrast, now we turn to business life, and Tibor, just give me a number. How many unread emails do you have now in your mailbox, approximately?
I try to avoid to have too many emails, but
just a number.
Maybe 20 from today, but by the end of the day, there will be 0 because I don't go to sleep without at least deciding whether I answer or not. Because I think we spoke a lot about speaking, communication, and when we speak about communication, we think about what to say, how to say. But I think the other part is also very important, how to listen, how to react. And as a manager, I know how important it is, the so-called active listening, which means I not just hear, but I hear with my ears, but I hear with my heart, with my mind, with myself. And this is what we call servant leadership, when the manager is not just here to say and to give commands and control and to speak, but to listen, to understand, as Peter said, to get into the communion with the other party, whether he's in another job or whether in another position, and that balance, that makes the communication balanced. And that's when we really communicate in a communion and not just give monologues to each other.
Mm-hmm. But Tibor, you are really a so-called hardcore businessman working in a very competitive international environment, and I know that efficiency, being effective, are really leading buzzwords in this world. And is efficiency beyond everything in communication, even beyond human dignity and relationships at the workplace?
It depends on the founder, on the leaders. It can be felt in the company atmosphere, in the daily practice, and there are very different approaches. And yes, in some cases, it's just about giving commands and to understand and to follow the instructions. And in certain industries and in certain life cycles of companies, that can be even valid and justified. Whereas in other industries and other life cycles, if you try to govern an organization on that way, that will kill you. You won't be competitive, and it's even financially hurting. And I think since our culture and the 21st century goes into the direction where we need everybody's mind and even soul and heart jointly and integrated, therefore more and more it's important that we not only use the communication as a one way or as a two focus for information and that data sharing, but to work, for example, on team spirit, where companies invest a lot into creating team spirit. It's exactly a thing where there's no real information sharing. It's not about more knowledge. It's about getting together, becoming more friends with each other, and in that way, cross-fertilizing each other's ideas and to rely on each other to create trust. And all these words, I think, like trust, for example, which was mentioned as the latest one, are words which we haven't used in management 20, 30 years ago, but there is more and more in our vocabulary when we speak not only about management, but about leadership.
Mm-hmm. And Tibor, how do you, just a really short question, that how do you measure your efficiency in communication, and does it differ from the mainstream management practices, or you can apply all of them without any limitations?
As we know, normally, and it's by law, every company has to have a financial statement about the profit and to pay the taxes and so on. And we usually look at the bottom line, so-called bottom line, which is profit or loss. And nowadays, in the past 20, 30 years, we have a more complex view. Sometimes it's called triple bottom line, or there are some other aspects as well. But basically, the message is that the company is not only here to create a profit, but also it should have purpose and goals and measurable outcomes from a social point of view, and also from an environmental point of view. And I think the same goes down to the communication. In some cases, it's really just to inform each other. I need a number, for example, the bottom line number for certain purposes. And in some cases, I need to understand the atmosphere, the working climate, the motivation, whether there is intrinsic motivation or people are just here to work because they get a salary at the end of the month. And since more and more research shows that, for example, in the United States recently, 2/3 of the employees work only for the money they get at the end of the month, that's terrible. And that's also because they got used as a mean to generate profit. And for the same reason, they consider their 8-10 hours a day as a necessary or even as a must, an obligation to keep them alive and the family as well. How much better it would be, and it's for the 1/3 it works, to have a motivation that we start every day something to create together. It includes communication as well. And at the end of the day, we can go home with a knowledge, not just impression, that we created something. The world became better. Maybe a product is now better, or maybe a new innovation happened. But even if it's a daily regular work, it can be done with different approaches. And I think this is very important. And that's why we need this communion type communication instead of just throwing in information through emails or Excel sheets or even through Zoom.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you very much. It's really an interesting topic, and hopefully there will be lots of comments and questions on the internet, and I address the audience to write questions on the Facebook to us. And now I turn to Sister Helen again, that when you mentioned in the interview that the new digital communication forms and technologies cannot be handled as human development just because of their pure existence. So under what conditions do they really serve the common good, and especially the human dignity?
Well, I think we need to treat digital communications like we treat any kind of technology, in this sense that the difficulties that we face, maybe the crisis we might say that we face in terms of communication and social relations that are being caused by these type of technology, is something that we faced in the past in different circumstances. When the steam engine came in, it absolutely transformed people's experience of life, and we had to learn how to use this technology, and it also caused a lot of damage in the process, but we gradually managed to get it under control. So I think we need to think about technology in this way. We can basically have two approaches to technological design. One, which has been called by different thinkers, different names. There's a famous anthropologist I talked about in the video, Lewis Mumford, who calls it biotechnics. Other people have called it human-centered technology. We might say maybe green technology, depends a bit because it's a bit of a vague term. But anyway, in a proper sense of the term, we might say green technology is like that now. What is this idea? The idea is that the technology is making life more rich. It's increasing human skill. It's creating more possibilities for us than we had before. It's adding something. And it's being inserted into a way of life. It's not dominating over the way of life and controlling and cutting down our freedom, but it's increasing our freedom. And then, of course, the other kind is the type which is the opposite, which is what Luke Mumford calls the monotechnic. Other people have called technocentric. And it's where ultimately people are using technology to control other people. In the early Industrial Revolution, the mill owners that wanted a spinning machine that they could control, they gave a commissioning document to Richard Roberts, who designed the self-acting mule, as it was called, in 1830. And on the document it said, we want a machine that can be run by a child or a monkey. They wanted to take all the human skill out of the job so they could control the process. And so we see this happening a lot. We see these two types of technology occurring all the time. And we can see this in digital technology as well. We've just been talking today. You asked the question, what are the good experiences you have with digital technology, and we all had some different ones. So we do have some positive experiences, but we also see a lot of negative experiences. And there's a lot of important books that are being written about this now. Shoshana Zuboff's book, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, or a book which I think is even more interesting, written by a former Google engineer who Peter might know because he was studying, he did a PhD in philosophy in Oxford, James Williams. He wrote a book called Stand Out of Our Light. Yep. And it's a reference to Diogenes and what Diogenes said to Alexander when Alexander the Great came to visit him. Anyway, he talks about how the best engineers coming out of the best programs are put by Facebook especially, but some of the other big companies too, to design, using this idea called persuasive technology, design systems to keep young people, especially young people's attention constantly on the phones, so that they sleep as little as possible, they do as little as possible of anything else, they stay focused on their phones. And he calls this adversarial technology. And I think it's right. It's damaging people. It's set up to damage people in order to make as much money as possible, because they are making their money out of advertising. So they want people to see as much advertising as possible. So we can see these two types of technological development are going on side by side. What we need to do is to reinforce the positive side, set up the legal systems that will do that. And Europe is trying to do that more and more. Have the kind of approach to life, thinking about virtues, thinking about human development, thinking about human dignity, that will help us reinforce the positive use of this technology. We can do it. We just have to set our minds to it.
Well, Father Alejandro, I think we can agree on that, fully understood communication without distortion is impossible, whether it's personal or digital. And if it's so, then when we compare the two kind of communication techniques or modes, then we actually compare two imperfect communication modes. Then what is the difference? Only the proportion or the measure of the distortion?
I would like to say what Sister Helen said. So basically, it is how we are using communication and the depth of that communication. I think that's where it counts, because the technology, social media, so it's simply a technology, simply a medium through which we can communicate. It's an instrument. And so, yes, of course, every instrument will create static in the communication, but that also can happen on a one-on-one communication because of different cultural backgrounds, because of accents, because of different languages, etc. So static is always present in the communication process, even if it's on one-on-one communication. On social media, sometimes there's a greater degree of that, and sometimes also actually that static can be canceled. So it can work both ways. I mean, one thing that Sister Helen mentioned at the beginning that just kind of hit me was, originally, most of the communication we used to do was not personal, but was through letters. And then it reminded me of a book I read a long time ago called Love and Salt, a Spiritual Friendship Through Letters. And it talks about all the saints that had intimate relationships. I mean, we can talk about St. Catherine of Siena and Raymond of Capua. I mean, their letters are so intimate, full of spirituality, that it was even better than actually being present one-on-one, because I think, like our students in the classroom, when they are in the classroom on media, somehow they feel freer to be able to speak, especially if they're shy. So students that never spoke in the classroom, now through media actually do speak. And I think sometimes we do tend to reveal more when we are when it's a mediated communication than is one-on-one. And we can see even from the scriptures themselves, I mean, as I was talking originally about sacramentality and the scriptures in liturgy, etc. Again, the whole gospel is being transmitted through us through word. It's not St. Paul who's right there speaking to us, but somehow he is through his letters, through his communication. So I think it's how we use the instruments. I think right now the social media is too new for us, and we tend to use it in a kind of a business model. We use email to communicate information, to keep up, you know, what's going on, whatever. But we except for some people, I say, that are using more Instagram and using WhatsApp, but even those mediums, I saw it more on Snapchat, where people are actually sharing more of their emotions, more of their feelings, really trying to connect to other people through this means. And so I think it's more how much are we able to open ourselves through these instruments, and that's going to make the whole difference. So again, if we're using technology to be really human-centered, or is it just technology for technology's sake, to be able to be efficient and to be able to accomplish a task. So I think that also qualifies whether the technology itself is enabling us to become fully human, or somehow is just making us one more instrument in this whole process of communication.
Mm-hmm. Well, you and Sister Han also mentioned the dark side of digital communication. And I confess that sometimes it seems to me that the Lord of the Flies, you know, the well-known book from William Golding, just happens right before our eyes on the internet, and there are unregulated tribes getting more and more isolated and fighting against each other very aggressively. So, Professor Rono, where will it lead, this kind of activity on the internet? Will it remain in the digital world at the end of the day, or what will happen?
Well, to be totally honest with you, I don't know. I am not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on any of these media. And I think I will finish my life without going on to these things because I just don't really like them. So what I find in some ways more troubling is that even those who are critical of electronic media and are cognizant of the enormous damage that Facebook and others are causing to people, approach the question from what I would describe as a humanist approach, concerned with human values, human dignity, the exceptional nature of the individual, and so on and so forth. Now, without getting into a complicated theological discussion, there is an issue here. And the issue is, were we humans made in the image of God, such that the rest of creation is there to serve us? Or are we part of this creation? If we take the first view, as indeed a fair portion of Catholic theology does, I think we are in trouble. I think creation is not going to put up with that. It's not going to accept even humanist arrogance. It's not going to accept the exceptionality of the human being. I think God's creation is, I mean, my sense of God's creation, my view of God's creation, is that we have a place in it, and we have to find that place and live with it, and abandon these extraordinary efforts to exceptionalism, to be just one step below God, but well above the rest of creation, and abandon this highly destructive effort to control creation, to transform it, and in fact destroy it. I think that the data about the destruction of creation is absolutely frightening. I mean, the stuff that one sees if one follows the kind of environmental destruction that is taking. Just the other day, I think it was an American agency that came out with the news that that the magnitude of heat retention by the Earth has doubled since 2005. So the heat that comes towards the Earth from the sun doesn't go out. It accumulates, resulting in, I think today it's 49 degrees Celsius in Arizona. 49 degrees Celsius in Arizona. And it will be 50 degrees tomorrow. And so on and so forth. The oceans, I mean, the magnitude of the destruction of God's creation that we have reached is absolutely phenomenal. And there has to come a point where we Catholics really have to face up to that. And I think the Pope does. I think Pope Francis does. But I think we should be sort of louder about it. And to answer your question, unless we cut back on this notion that we are the privileged member of creation, there is no solution to the problem that you describe. And these media and these things will continue carry us and push us further on this extraordinarily destructive path. Sorry to be pessimistic, but I'm scared.
Maybe not pessimistic, but realistic, but I'm not here to make a judgment upon that. But on the other hand, Tibor, I think you realize nearly the same, so you can agree with Professor Rona, but you defined yourself as a Christian businessman, and you have a much higher responsibility since you're leading several hundreds or even bigger organizations, temporary or for a longer period, and you can have an impact. And what are the most valuable side effects, or maybe not only side effect, but positive effects in communication during the pandemic, lockdown, and especially the home office period, in a broader sense, I mean, in the world of work? And how can you help your co-workers in home office, for example, in the light of Laudato Si, Fratelli Tutti, and all the philosophy what was mentioned by Professor Rona?
I would continue with the thoughts of Peter, because it's really the question. The question really is whether we think that we are the whole world is for us, to serve us, including God, by the way, because that would mean that we put ourselves above God. Because if you look at God, He is the first and prime example of servant leadership. He became servant. He served us. He gives us His freedom. We have a full freedom. We can either ruin the creation, or we can find our part, or we can serve. And it's the same in the business, I think, as well. We can misuse people. We can look at them as numbers in an Excel sheet and as costs to be eliminated, or we can see them as persons, as our friends, as our, even if you don't know them personally, then the same kind of individuals on the image of God, and that should and can impact our behavior. And I think communication is therefore very important, because we spoke about truth, we spoke about communication, the additional gestures and so on, behavior, relationship. That's much more than just sending information to each other. And in the first part of the pandemic situation, I think that was a kind of a shock. We feel alone. It's difficult to find the contacts to continue what we have started. And now we have another kind of problem, that people don't want to even partially to go back to work, for example, physically. Yesterday, in Wall Street Journal, there was an article about it, that people are ready to go into hotels, ready to go to restaurants, but not back to their workplaces. There was a company mentioned in San Francisco, which has 10,000 employees, and only 200 returned physically to get back to the offices. And also a lot of consequences. The canteens in the office buildings, they are empty, and they face liquidity problems and bankruptcy problems. So it has a lot of consequences, positive, negative as well. And I think we, as mankind, man, creation on the image of God, have to find a solution for the whole situation in the way which Helen Alford mentioned, common good. We are responsible not just for ourselves, not just for our families, not just for our family, but for the 8 billion people on Earth. And we, for example, know, we have to know, and we read it, and the statistics and everything show that the biggest victims and most hurt people of the pandemic were not the general managers and not you and not me, but the poor people in poor countries who lost, for example, through the tourism, they lost the chance to earn money serving the foreigners. And we have to find solutions, and we cannot just focus on our own problem. And I think that's why it is very important to really think strategically, and strategically meaning not just what is a good strategy for my company or for my division or for my department or for myself, but for our global community. And we speak a lot about, through the technical experience, about being in a global village. And that's true. Everybody is very close. We are here from different countries and so on. But does it mean, or have we achieved that we are in a global village, a global friendly brothers and sisters? And I think the answer is not. We were very active to vaccine the first world, and now we try to think about the second and third world, but with the justification that if we don't support their vaccination, we will be again impacted. And usually, and if you read the articles, the justification is we have to share our knowledge and we have to even donate vaccines to the third world, so they don't infect us again. But not because of the responsibility that we are here 8 billion people, everybody was impacted, and we should find a solution which is a solution for all the 8 billion people.
Well, I think you mentioned the pandemic, and the pandemic is somehow more or less over, at least in Hungary, where the third wave has just went down, and we are returning to normal life in certain senses. But what lessons should be learned in the field of communication? And very briefly, try to summarize in one sentence, into one message you would like to pin out to everyone's front door to remember and to keep in mind, maybe during the next wave or after the pandemic, when everything is over and we return to the life where we have started before. So what would be your message, your one sentence to remember? Anyone can start now, the bravest one.
Well, I think I will take a leaf from Michael Polanyi and rephrase what he said and say the following sentence. The internet is an excellent means of getting information from point A to point B, C, D, and E, and so forth. But it is not good for communicating what we know.
Thank you. Who will be the next?
I think I would say, if it's communication after the pandemic, my phrase would be, let's all ask ourselves, am I my brother's keeper? Should I care for my brother? Because I think that's how we got through the pandemic in many cases. especially the people that Thibaut was talking about, who were really badly affected, with people helping each other. And so let's learn from that. Let's connect all our great technical things that we have to this basic principle of taking care of each other, thinking of ourselves as our brothers' keepers.
Father Alejandro?
Would be that we depend on each other, which can be seen as a bad news, and it can be seen as a good news. And I would like to see it as a good news, as a motivation, this experience that everybody was impacted, everybody had the same goal to come back, to continue, and to think in this kind of unity worldwide for mankind as one global family in this global village, which global village was made on technical aspect, and the global spirituality and the global brotherhood could be made on a spiritual basis.
How about you, Father Alejandro?
I would say that one of the things that the pandemic helped a lot of people, it's to see priorities, what is really important in life. And I think it made us really reflect, not only as individuals, but as the humanity, to really realize what is important. I think one of the articles I had read at one point also why people are not going back to work is because they realize they can work from home, where they can still have interaction with their families, where they're never before they were never present at the family. They were going off to work, especially in America. We have to commute for 3-4 hours, and then work for 5-6 hours and then commute back. So they realized ultimately what is important in life. I mean, it's the relationships, which is where we're talking about communication. Why do people still feel lonely at the end of all this media? Is because we are missing the relationship. There's something there. So I would say, think what's really important in life, which is already something we've been reflecting during this pandemic. And I think we need to act upon it at the end of the pandemic to really live it out. And I think a lot of people have realized, as I saw from these kids wanting to come back to school, they realize that. They realize what is really important is their relationships, to be with others, to be and work with others. I think that's the most important thing.
Thank you very much. And well, if you don't mind, we will utilize these sentences and ideas in the future as short messages on the website or on the mass media as well, or Facebook. And to make it more personal, or between the panel members, I would like to ask you to address one another with a very short question you are having in your mind during this conversation. And I would ask Sister Helen to start with, to address a question. We have missed Professor Zamani, we have lost him. And you should address a question to Father Alejandro, if you don't mind.
Okay, yeah. So I would like to ask Alejandro, after the things that you've said, you are a person who knows a lot about migration and about difficulties of cultures meeting each other. What would you say that we could learn for the difficulties that we have in digital communications from these other kinds of difficulties that we have? Can we learn something from this other area to help us deal with the digital difficulties?
Yeah, it's a good question. I already kind of mentioned a little bit of it, in the sense that when we're dealing with migration, we're dealing, for example, dealing with different cultures, people from different backgrounds, different social classes, etc., somehow confronting themselves or encountering themselves because of different circumstances. That forces somebody to leave their home country, go through another country to arrive to another country. And all of this are different confrontations and interactions, etc. So I think the same thing happens in social media, because now, as we said, our world has opened up even more, and we are encountering other peoples, dealing with other cultures, etc. And so again, it was also mentioned in this conference, I think the important thing about listening. I think when a lot of times we try to be technocrats and we try to find solutions for everything as opposed to listening. And one of the biggest things we learn, especially with dealing with migrants, is to be able to listen to their stories and to really be able to offer them what they really need, what they really want. Because sometimes we assume this is what you really need. Since you're in our country, you probably need a language course, you probably need this. We kind of give solution, and it's a very normal tendency of us to find solutions to everything we find. And sometimes we just simply need to listen to the story of the other, listen to their experience. And I think also in social media, there's become a lot of talking heads. We have a lot of talking heads talking different languages, different ideas, etc. Hatred as well as love, etc. But it's a cacophony of speaking, and we're really not listening. So I think one of the things we can learn of the experience of migrants and intercultural dialogue, interreligious dialogue, is first of all to listen. And I think that's a key element we need to bring into this whole system of social communication, not only to speak, to be talking heads, but also to be able to listen to the other.
And Father Alejandro, what would you like to ask to Professor Ronan?
Well, Peter brought to tears to me also because of the great uncle story. I think that the question is also with that story, how can we promote empathy? Because I think that's what your great uncle had, was able to empathize. And it's something that we have lost a lot. We are so bombarded with the news, with information, that somehow, that people are dying in the Gaza Strip, for example. We don't really have the connection, the emotional, maybe because we cannot deal with it. I know a lot of younger people suffer trauma, fears, because for them, in one sense, everything that's on the news is like it was next door. But at the same time, I think we've lost empathy. We lost to be able to understand really the emotional connection with the other, which I think that was what that was the key to your great uncle. So how can we gain back this empathy?
Well, I think the basic problem with the basic obstacle to regaining it is that we are flooded, we are drowning in falsehoods. And because we are drowning in falsehoods, we ourselves have great difficulty in being truthful. We don't even know when we are truthful and when we are kind of, making it up, winging it, whatever the word is, or outright lying. Today we have world leaders who spend their entire time fabricating falsehoods. And I think that under those circumstances, empathy has a very, very difficult time. Because I mean, my great uncle knew who he was. There was no question about it. And people immediately recognized who he was. So that connection that I was talking about, could come into being fairly quickly. But when you're looking at a person and you don't know who that person is, because that person is impersonating all kinds of roles and personalities, and assuming things and so on and so forth. That's it. There's nothing to do. So I think that it's an Aquinas message that I have, which is about the truth, that Stefano briefly mentioned, that it's not very fashionable these days, but that it's very important. It's a rather fundamental part of Thomist thought, and in fact, I think the Dominicans, as a tradition, are very much concerned. Dominican thought is very much concerned about truth, I don't know how to do it. I despair at what I'm seeing. I do despair. But I think that the best that one can do is to, first of all, start with ourselves, not to lie. No matter what, not to lie. And then to the extent that we can, to insist that everybody else around us be truthful and to be accepting of everybody around us. I mean, you know, truth can be very painful, but accept it. It's much better than any of the other garbage. That's my very modest answer.
Thank you very much. And Professor Runa, you and Tibor, he are representing here the business life. So one might say that you understand each other without words, but let's have a try to address or formulate a question to Tibor.
Yeah, I think to what extent do you see the emergence of the serious emergence in an operative sense, in actually doing something, of values other than efficiency and profit?
I personally am a co-founder and also one of the leaders of a new association in Hungary, which is called Social Impact Investors Association. And the purpose of this association is that we share the message with the potential investors that even in case of an investment, you can either ask the only question, is it profitable or not, and how to maximize the profit, or you can say, I have capital, I would like to make use of this capital in a way which serves the society. And whether it brings profit and how much profit is necessary is part of sustainability, but the prime goal should be and can be of businesses to serve the society. And just about 2 days ago, I read the latest number, which was available, that worldwide about $33 billion are invested under the umbrella of impact investment. $33 billion compared to the total investment is a niche market or a fraction, but 33 billion as a number, especially for us, but also from a broader perspective, is becoming significant. And it's not just about money, it's about people. I heard a lecturer, a professor from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and she mentioned that 80% of her students would like to start a social business after receiving the diploma. So they don't join the big Swiss, banks or other organizations. Their aim is to do something which makes sense for them as their life and which makes sense for the society. And I think this kind of approach and this kind of mentality is present, is still maybe very small, but it's growing. And such events like this event today hopefully can help to let it grow further.
And in order to close the circle, now Tibor should address the last question to Sister Helen.
Helen, you mentioned that on one side, this technocentric approach is very, very dangerous. On the other hand, you mentioned that, for example, this kind of digital education made the students more active to ask questions. My question, more general question, is how do you think how can be education reformed, modified, or adjusted to make the next generation aiming better this kind of human flourishing which we are discussing here and today?
Well, I think we need to face a big issue, and that is that up until very recently, education systems have been mostly instructional systems, and they have relied on other groups in society, mostly families, and other kinds of communities, religious communities, other groups, to help people grow as good characters, become good people. That the education systems have been more focused on the instructional side, as Professor Zamani was saying. So I think the really big frontier for education now is that we probably can't go forward, continue to go forward like this. We have to find other ways of helping people grow as a good person, as a person that's growing in virtue, as a person realizing their potential, alongside giving them interesting information which they can use. And I think this will mean that we will need to, one of the things we will need to do is to increase the amount of service learning. The International Federation of Catholic Universities now has a big project on service learning, on other experiential types of learning, partly because people can get basic information more and more from just looking up on the web. Okay, it needs to be curated. We need to give them guidance. They can get a lot of very false information, the falsehoods that Peter was talking about as well. But as long as they have some kind of guide, they can get a lot of information. We need to help them know how to use it, so that, for instance, they can set up their social businesses that they want to do, that they can put together some knowledge with some good way of life and carry this forward in their lives ahead of them. And what can the digital sphere do for us? Well, I think it will be mostly a source of information and instruction. I think we have to find new teaching techniques, new ways of sharing with people that are helping them grow as people. And I think, Paul VI in his encyclical about evangelization talked about how we need witnesses more than just preachers or teachers, that we teachers, and of course it means a lot more from us in a way, we have to be more witnesses and share more of our life somehow with young people and help them to see some examples of people that they could try to emulate. I think that is going to become a bigger part of our teaching mission in the future. Along with a lot of other things that will need to happen, but it's one of the things.
Well, thank you very much. And one question came from the audience, so we turn to these questions. I try to translate it. That it says that we are digital kindergarten kids, and the culture of online communication. Or the level of online communication culture is extremely low. How can it be changed? I addressed this question first to Professor Rona, and of course everyone can add and join.
I think it's a very good question, a very important question. I think we are in a phase where actually, not unlike in many other cases where society encounters a serious problem and does not know what to do with it, and then through a process of trial and error starts to legislate, make laws, sometimes bad ones, and corrects them, sometimes building organizations and institutions and so forth to overcome it. So just to stay with the theme I previously described, the electronic communication is a wonderful way of disseminating falsehoods. Falsehoods used to have, dissemination of falsehoods used to have very serious consequences. You weren't supposed to do that. And there were serious social penalties for engaging in that sort of behavior. Now, we don't have the means, the techniques for penalizing people who are disseminating out and out lies through Facebook. We just don't, we don't know what to do. We might say that it's not true, but it's out, and there's no penalty involved in the dissemination of falsehoods. I suspect that as we go down the road, we will start to, there will be public demand to take it away and to prohibit it and to do something about it. I mean, it's in a way, it's similar to the problem of pornography. The public would like to see the curtailment of pornography, but we don't quite know how to do it. And certainly the Facebook type multinational corporations do not seem to be particularly interested in doing anything genuinely effective about it. So I think that, just like in many other instances in our past, society will have to go through the pain and suffering caused by the dissemination of falsehoods through the internet until it will say, well, that's enough. We have had enough of this, and we'll develop ways and means of dealing with it and penalizing people who use it inappropriately.
Anyone would like to add something? Well, feel free, Sister Helen. I see that something is in you. And so.
Well, I was just thinking of something, not exactly in answer to the question, but it occurred to me with the question that I asked Alejandro when I said, about the migration, and that, of course, we use this term, the digital migrant or immigrant, for people, like Peter, like myself, who find themselves slightly strangers in the digital world. And in that sense, we're not necessarily the people who are most, I think this is one of the problems that we have, the people who are sort of in their 50s or 60s or 70s, the people who are more in the sort of influential positions are not necessarily the ones who know the most about this, the effects of this technology on their lives. And it's that, I think, is one of the things which means that we're a bit slower in reacting to it, and the kinds of problems that Peter was talking about. And so in that sense, we need to listen more to the younger people and their problems.
Thank you very much. And there's one question from my side, as really the last one, I promise, but it works in me really that we who are using actively community media platforms and have now somehow two identities. One can be explored in interpersonal communication, and another one, a kind of digital identity or an avatar, which can be explored from our digital fingerprints in internet and on social media. Which identity is real? The first one, the second one, both or none? Or how can we gain integrity in that field? Tibor or Professor Ono, please.
In my view, you gave the answer in your question. It's not one or the other. It depends on you whether these are just two forms or these are two different individuals or two different images. And if there is integrity, that means that you use different channels, different ways. You can use a color picture or a black and white, or you can describe yourself or whatever, but it's you. And I think this is very important, to have one identity across different forms, situations, whether you are a manager or whether you are a father at home or a friend or a neighbor or someone taking part on the street. Since the past 2 weeks, I switched from car to e-bike, and I have a completely new way of looking at the different situations on the streets and how these strange car drivers behave, which I was for 40 years, and which I do now as well. And my idea was to give it's just an idea, but to give a kind of obligation to everybody to use the bicycle just for one day, because it would bring us together, to be able to think on the same way, whether you are on the bike or whether you are in a big car. And the same, I think, is important when we communicate, when we live, when we show our image and ourselves to the world.
I mean, I would say that in any kind of, just being human, we do play different roles. So, I play the role of dean, I play the role of professor, I play the role of being a Dominican friar to my brothers here, also the role of a priest to parishioners. And all of those require different skills, and in one sense, you are different in those different roles. And at one point, to tell you the truth, it is confusing and it is hard to say, well, who really am I? Am I the professor? Am I the dean? Am I the priest at the parish? Who am I? So that's something that happens already in daily life. And again, the call of the gospel to really look to integrity and to really say, I have to be authentic, but that's part of the quest, I think, of being human and being Christian, or really finding our true identity. And that's what Jesus is calling us to. But I do think that, in one sense, social media does enable a little bit even more the playing of roles that we have, let's say, in regular life. I can only think already of this whole program, New Life, when you can create a whole avatar where you can be somebody from another race, another gender, another culture, etc., and interact with a whole this series of other people on this platform who are also using avatars, so not showing their true selves. So I think in one sense, social media does provide another instrument, an easier instrument to kind of fake our roles or to create new roles that distance us from our true selves. And I think that's a big danger in social media. I think that's something being able, but at the same time, I say it's a struggle that we have even without social media. It's just, who am I truly? And what am I called to be? And I think that's part of the whole Christian journey and human journey of trying to discover who we are. And so again, as we've been speaking through this whole conference, the call to truth, the call to integrity, to authenticity, in every aspects of our lives. It's kind of, we cannot be Pharisees, play one role here and then be something else who we're truly not. Again, authenticity is key in everything that we do. But it's a difficult task. It's not, because to even understand ourselves, who we are, it's not that easy. I think it takes a whole lifetime basically to even discover who you are truly. So let alone what do you project, what do you communicate to the world? It's a whole other challenge too. And now with social media, that becomes a bigger challenge. But again, it does tend to help you to create more of these masks that separate the authentic self from your true self.
Professor Runa, you wanted to add something, but people was faster.
For many years, I thought that Charles Taylor's Sources of the Self was an absolute masterpiece. And I have recently reread it, and I still think it's a masterpiece, but I did feel it dated. And I think that it is now dated because of the internet, because of social media. The problem that Alejandro described is a known problem, and it is not a huge problem. It's something that we can handle and live with. When I'm a professor, I sort of try to behave according to the canons of being a professor. I sort of identify with it. I put into the job whatever I can that comes from heart and soul and brain and whatever. But it's not a horribly difficult problem. We have an entirely new phenomenon, which I might call the Kardashian Syndrome, where you have individuals totally inventing a personality without any source, a totally synthetic invention. That's different from what you describe. Here is a person who is as synthetic as a rubber doll and deliberately constructed according to market research. Now, it may be that this construction is simply, a profit-making endeavor, but it really is a deeper issue. And I think that it is the electronic media that has generated the possibility for the flourishing of these entirely synthetic constructions. That there's no trace, no human trace in the behavior, the manifestations, the appearance, the gestures of these sorts of people. Utterly synthetic. And for the time being, rather successful. I do have enough faith in humanity to believe that this will crash and seriously crash, and people will get totally fed up with it and discard it. But for the time being, going back to the question that was raised before from the audience, it is a mark of the infancy of our internet culture that these entirely synthetic phenomena it is a genuine what medieval theologians call persona ficta, which translated from the Latin means a made person. Ficta comes from making in Latin. A made mask, really, a persona is a mask, a made mask that Catholic theology robustly rejected at the time, and with it robustly rejected the original persona ficta, which was the corporation, and fought tooth and nail against the introduction of this persona ficta because it detected in it a fundamental falsehood. Now that fundamental falsehood is what we are seeing today through the electronic media, the appearance through the electronic media of these synthetic personalities.
Thank you very much. And
I would just like to add something to what Peter said, because yes, I agree in general, but there's some, first of all, I don't think it's like the Kardashians, I totally agree with the whole question. But we've had this from way back. Every movie star that was produced by the Hollywood studios of the 1920s and 30s and 40s, that was the whole function of cinema, was to create this illusion of a different world, especially during the 1930s when we had the Depression. So even the movie theater itself was a different world. It was full of glamour and so on. And so it's something, but it goes back, to from the very beginning that we do tend to, because even with talking to the cultural issue, even as a migrant myself, you are called by the culture, let's say the Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture of the United States, to be something other than what I am as a Latino Roman Catholic.
Yeah.
So that social role that I have to play, if I want to interact and be able to live in that world, I have to play it. because if I'm other, I'm excluded. And, you know, of course, now where there's more consciousness, I mean, that's what we're fighting. Tomorrow is, in America, we finally have as a federal holiday, the Juneteenth celebration, which celebrates the emancipation of the African American. And they really don't want to call it emancipation. They want to call it the Independence Day of the African Americans. Mm-hmm. And again, it's because it's a question also of that society creates this kind of persona ficta, what it means to be an American, for example. And so that's what we're kind of protesting now. That's American is, I am an American, you're an American, the other one's an American. We are European, you know, being here now in Europe, it has been the same negotiation, what it means to be a Latino American in Italy, in Europe. And there's certain expectations, even in conferences, I've noticed, because I mean, one simple thing in America, in a conference, you're expected to be very practical. You have to be to the point. What is this going to change? What is it? And in Europe, we tend to be more on the philosophical aspect. What's the idea? So, you know, so you have to learn all those language, all those roles. In one sense, I think they're fake. I mean, they expect, it's like a construction, it's a social construction. And so that's why the only thing I would warn a little bit, that a lot of things that, yeah, we considered outside of the realm of the virtual are also social constructions. And as I'm preparing a course.
I agree with that. I just think that this feels different. I mean, you know, you're quite right in pointing out how, Hollywood promoted Jane Mansfield, to cite a predecessor of Kardashian. But Jane Mansfield was somehow, you know, still an understandable human being. It was, you know, it was, I didn't feel there was a person I couldn't talk to, that I had nothing to do with. I didn't have that feeling. I appreciate your point about it being, you know, artificial constructs and personalities being devised to promote the career of an actor or promote a film or a studio and so on. So entirely true. I say, but I think that there is a new element in this, which the utter, complete dehumanized self. In the Charles Taylor sense, a self without a source. And that's new. You're right about the artificiality, and that is a common denominator. But the artificiality had sources, had cultural, historic, personal, etc. sources that were transformed and manipulated and so on and so forth. Here you have someone inventing an utterly synthetic, totally synthetic self and selling it as such with great success. And that, I think, is the product of the electronic media.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree, because I think I just read an article about conspiracies of today, and unlike conspiracies of the past, that they always had a grain of truth that were based on some element of truth.
Yeah.
Today we do have conspiracies that have no foundation or any reality, and that's the world. So yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
Well, dear guest, I wish we had more time, but it's nearly more than 2 hours we have been talking, and I think at the end of the discussion we simply identified new topics to discuss in the future. For example, the truth, the identity, or naturality. What does it mean in the human person's life? So I hope that it was not the last time we met in this circle, and we will continue our discussion for the benefit of others as well. And instead of a pre-written academic closing words, just let me share my personal story, one of my personal story about digital communication. And for that, I try to share my screen, and hopefully it works. Because this word in the last 1.5 years means really a digital challenge in every family. I just give you an impression what an everyday could look like in our home. And digital education was really a very hard business for every parent. And if you add it to this, that you have to be a parent under these circumstances, you go to your workplace, if it works, because you may work at home in home office as well, then fighting parallel in time into battlefield. And then you go to serve others who are on the internet, because all the meetings, real personal meetings, are prohibited simply. So these 2 years were simply very tough, or 1.5 years. But my story is that, well, earlier, more than 4 years, I was the CEO and I was responsible for the whole transportation in Budapest. And I thought that my job is very, very important, and I'm a very important person, and everything comes after my very important duty. And of course, it was a 24-hour duty in a certain sense, because the city must have worked and functioned. But it was a big burden to my family. And one of my kids made and sticked it right in front of my eyes, these installation, let's call it, where we have the dinner. And it was necessary, because sometimes just telling to me in front of the mirror that I am a very important man. And very often I picked up my phone also during the dinner. And that's the divine pedagogy manifesting in this installation. Because the first message is saying that I love you, which can be translated to the sentence that I want to be in connection with you. And the second one gives a very straightforward warning and showing the way at the same time how this personal connection can be built up and maintained. So, in that way, that we learn and we practice the personal focused, exclusive attention. And that was the biggest lesson I've learned in that period. We have to focus on one person at a time. I confess, I don't believe in multitasking in any sense. It's simply a myth. So I think, and my message is at the end of the day, that we should practice this kind of exclusive bilateral communication in the family, in the working place, or at the workplace, and even in relation to God, much more intensively. And I'm really very thankful for your sharing and for your time, dear guests, because that is the most scarce resource we can give as a present to each other. And I really appreciate your contributions. And if you don't mind, now I switch back to Hungarian and giving some technical information to the audience, which can be useful in the future as well, but then I will return. Kedves vendégeink, kedves hallgatóság, ezekkel a gondolatokkal köszönjük meg a szervezők, a KETEG közösség és a 72 tanítványmozgalom nevében is azt, hogy velünk tartottak. Kérem, hogy kövessék a KETEG és a 72 Tanítvány Mozgalom Facebook oldalát nyomon, illetve honlapjainkon is nagyon sok információ elérhető, különösen a KETEG képzésről, amelynek vigyék hírét ajánlják ismerőseiknek, és jelentkezzenek minél többen az őszi képzésre, ahol hasonló témákat, hasonló kvalitású szakemberekkel lehet megvitatni. Az előadások, interjúk és a mai kerekasztal beszélgetés is a konferencia keretében elérhető lesz YouTube csatornáinkon és a közösségi média felületeinken. Azt kívánom önöknek, hogy éljenek okosan és mértékkel a digitális világ nagyszerű lehetőségeivel, de beszélgessenek minél többet személyesen. Egymással is, és Istennel is. Köszönjük, hogy velünk tartottak, a viszontlátásra. So thank you very much for your contribution, really, because it was a tremendous experience for me. I know it was exhausting. It has lasted more than 2 years, and because of the lack of the interpretation, because of the technical problem, it wasn't designed that way. But hopefully in the future, because of the technical possibilities, we can synchronize it and deliver one in English and another one in Hungarian, and the audience can choose which one prefers. So I stopped this sharing, but this installation was really very heart-touching for me and changed the way I use even the smartphone at home. So,
okay.
Thank you very much. And hopefully we will meet in the near future in person somewhere in Hungary, or in any part of the world, maybe in Rome, when we celebrate that Sister Helen became director, as Professor Zamenyi wished earlier. So there are lots of things to celebrate, and please pray for the KETEG, for the whole community, and for the whole education system we are going to develop, and especially for the semester starting in September, that more and more people should be addressed and take the courage to join and to start a 2-year seminary. So thank you very much. It was really a pleasure for me, especially for Professor Rono, we've never met before. And I learned a lot from your interview and for your contribution today as well. I know Helen from earlier, we met in Hungary, and I love you simply. I cannot formulate in a different way. And Alejandro, really your interview with Árpád Baranyi was really a very good one. I enjoyed it from deep of my heart. And Tibor, of course, we know each other for I don't know how many decades, but I don't count it. And we follow and follow each other and pray for each other's services as well. And with Sister Laura, we keep on working together. We collaborate together. We not just communicate, but we collaborate in a good sense, but not in a contractual way. So we don't make a deal. It's a covenant, and it's a great difference, I think. So it's a good to be the part of the KETEG, and thank you very much having you here today, and a very good weekend for all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your great job.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you for being here. We invite you next time.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.